When people talk about making their first $1 million, they often treat it as a finish line, a number that represents freedom, success, or proof that they've made it. But that framing misses the deeper point. The number itself isn't what matters, and what matters is what reaching that number usually signals that you've learned how to participate effectively in systems at scale. The real question isn't how to make $1 million. It's how value is created, captured, and compounded over time, and why some people manage to do that consistently while others, working just as hard, never quite get there. If you look at the data over the past century, one pattern is remarkably stable. Income from labor tends to grow slowly and predictably. Returns on capital, on the other hand, compound. That gap between selling your time and owning productive assets explains much of the divergence we see in financial outcomes. This isn't a moral judgment, and it isn't a conspiracy. It's a structural feature of how modern economies work. Capital scales, labor mostly doesn't. What often gets lost in popular discussions is that wealth is not created by money itself. Money is simply a claim on future productivity. Real wealth comes from solving problems in ways that can be repeated, distributed, and improved over time. That might happen through a business, a piece of software, a patent, a system, or even a well run institution. When those solutions scale, value compounds. When they don't, effort resets to zero each day. This is why the idea of a first million matters less as a milestone and more as a signal that compounding has started to work in your favor. Before that point, progress often feels linear and exhausting. After it, momentum begins to play a larger role, not because you suddenly become smarter or more disciplined, but because the system you built starts doing more of the work. It's also important to acknowledge that the environment matters. Technology has dramatically lowered the cost of starting and scaling things, but has also increased competition and compressed advantages. Markets reward clarity, focus, and leverage, not just effort. That's why two people can work equally hard and end up with radically different outcomes. One is operating inside a system that multiplies results. The other is trapped in one that doesn't. This is where the conversation needs to be more honest. Building wealth isn't about shortcuts or motivational slogans. It's about understanding how economic systems allocate rewards and then positioning yourself to contribute in ways that those systems recognize and reinforce. That requires learning, patience, and a willingness to think long term. Traits that don't always feel productive in the moment, but compound quietly over time. So when we talk about making your first million, what we're really talking about is learning how to move from effort based income to value based impact. Once that shift happens, the number itself becomes far less important than the process that produced it. To understand how people build lasting wealth, it helps to step back and look at how the economic system actually creates value. Most discussions focus on income, salaries, wages, bonuses, because those are visible and familiar. But income is only one small part of the system. Wealth emerges when income is converted into ownership of productive assets that generate value repeatedly, often with declining effort over time. At the center of this system are three forces working together: labor, capital, and institutions. Labor creates value through effort and skill. Capital amplifies that value by allowing work to scale beyond the limits of time. Institutions, including markets, laws, and technologies, determine how easily labor and capital can combine and how fairly the resulting gains are distributed. When these three elements align, productivity rises and wealth accumulates. When they don't, effort alone produces very little progress. Most people start with labor. They trade time and skill for money. This is necessary, but it has a ceiling. There are only so many hours in a day, and even highly skilled professionals eventually run into constraints. Capital changes that equation. Capital allows work done once to generate value many times over through ownership of businesses, intellectual property, or systems that operate independently of constant human input. This is why ownership matters so much. It converts effort into something that can compound. Technology has dramatically increased the power of this effect. Software, for example, allows a small team to serve millions of users with near zero marginal cost. The same principle applies in manufacturing, logistics, and finance. When systems are designed well, productivity grows faster than inputs, and that surplus is what creates wealth. Importantly, the system doesn't reward effort evenly, it rewards leverage. People who understand how to plug into scalable systems benefit disproportionately, even if they work fewer hours. Institutions shape who gets access to these systems. Financial markets determine who can raise capital. Education systems influence who gains the skills needed to participate. Legal frameworks decide how ownership is protected and transferred. When institutions function well, they lower friction and expand opportunity. When they fail, talent is wasted and growth slows. This is why wealth creation varies so dramatically across countries and even across regions within the same country. A critical but often overlooked factor is how incentives shape behavior. People respond rationally to the systems they're in. If long term investment is rewarded, people plan long term. If short term survival dominates, people optimize for immediacy. Many individuals remain stuck not because they lack discipline, but because the systems around them punish delayed gratification or make participation prohibitively complex. This is also why stories of individual success can be misleading. They highlight outcomes without explaining the structural context that made those outcomes possible. Understanding the system doesn't diminish individual effort, it explains where effort has the highest return. Wealth creation isn't about working harder in isolation. It's about aligning effort with systems that multiply its impact. When people talk about getting ahead, what they're often sensing is this gap between effort and leverage. The goal isn't to escape work, but to ensure that work builds something durable. Once you see the system clearly, the focus shifts from chasing income to designing participation in value creation itself. That shift is subtle, but it changes everything. One of the most misunderstood aspects of building wealth is how much of it comes down to incentives and mathematics rather than talent or intensity. People often assume success is primarily about effort, how hard you work, how many hours you put in, how disciplined you are. Effort matters, but it is rarely the limiting factor. The real constraint is whether your effort is connected to a system that compounds. Compounding is not a motivational idea, it's a mathematical one. Small advantages, when allowed to repeat over time, produce outcomes that feel disproportionate. And that's true in finance, but it's also true in learning, reputation, and technology. The challenge is that compounding works slowly at first. Early progress feels invisible, which makes it psychologically difficult to stick with long term strategies. Humans are wired to respond to immediate feedback, not delayed exponential growth. And this creates a mismatch between what feels productive and what actually is. Activities that generate fast feedback, responding to emails, attending meetings, staying busy often have low long term returns. Activities that generate compounding benefits, learning difficult skills, building systems, investing capital tend to feel slow and unrewarding in the beginning, yet over time, those are the actions that dominate outcomes. In financial terms, this is why the first meaningful amount of capital matters so much. When returns are small in absolute terms, progress feels negligible. A 10% return on a small base doesn't change behavior or options. But as that base grows, the same percentage produces outcomes that materially affect decision making. At that point, money stops being just income and starts functioning as a tool, one that can buy time, reduce risk, and enable better choices. What's often missed is that compounding applies just as powerfully to skills and judgment. A person who steadily improves their ability to analyze problems, make decisions, and allocate resources gains a form of leverage that compounds across decades. This is why learning has such an outsized return, especially early on. The benefit isn't just knowledge, it's improved decision quality applied repeatedly over time. Incentives play a crucial role in determining whether this compounding actually happens. People respond to what their environment rewards. If a system rewards short term output, people optimize for speed. If it rewards long term value creation, people invest in durability. Many professional environments unintentionally discourage compounding by prioritizing visible activity over long term results. That's not a moral failing, it's an incentive design problem. Understanding this helps explain why some people appear to accelerate while others stall. Even when they start from similar positions, the difference is often not ambition, but alignment. When incentives, skills, and time horizons align, progress compounds quietly and powerfully. When they don't, effort leaks away without producing lasting value. This also explains why patience is such a competitive advantage. Most people abandon strategies just before compounding takes effect. They switch paths because results feel slow, not because the approach is wrong. In reality, many worthwhile pursuits have long gestation periods. So the payoff comes later, but when it comes, and it tends to be durable, compounding then is not magic. It's the predictable result of systems that allow small, consistent gains to build on themselves. And understanding this changes how you evaluate opportunities. You stop asking whether something pays off immediately and start asking whether it can grow without proportional increases in effort. That shift in thinking is subtle, but it's one of the most reliable ways to improve long term outcomes, not just financially, but across nearly every domain where progress matters. One of the most persistent myths about success is that working harder is the primary solution. Effort matters, of course, but effort by itself rarely scales. In fact, many of the most hardworking people in the world remain economically constrained precisely because their effort is locked into systems that reset every day. When output is tied directly to hours worked, progress becomes linear. And linear progress, no matter how disciplined, has limits. This is not a critique of work ethic, it's a recognition of physics. Time is finite, energy is finite. Even the most capable individuals eventually hit ceilings if their contribution cannot be multiplied. What separates scalable effort from exhausting effort is leverage, the ability for work done once to continue producing value long after the initial input has ended. Leverage comes in several forms. Capital is one, code is another, media, systems, and institutional frameworks are others. These are tools that allow effort to persist. Writing a piece of software, building a process, or creating a product that serves thousands of people doesn't require thousands of hours every day. The work is front loaded and the returns accrue over time. And this is fundamentally different from roles where output disappears the moment attention shifts elsewhere. The modern economy increasingly rewards this kind of leverage. Technology has lowered the cost of replication almost to zero. A single improvement can reach millions instantly. That reality has reshaped nearly every industry, from finance to healthcare to education. Yet many people still operate as if effort alone determines outcomes. They push harder within systems that were never designed to scale for individuals. This creates a paradox. People feel busier than ever, yet often feel stuck. The issue is not laziness or lack of ambition, it's misalignment between effort and structure. When systems don't amplify output, more work simply leads to exhaustion, not progress. Understanding this doesn't make success guaranteed, but it does make it more predictable. It shifts the focus from working harder to working in ways that allow progress to persist. That shift from effort to leverage, from motion to momentum, is one of the most important transitions anyone can make when trying to build something that lasts. One of the reasons people struggle to build durable wealth is not a lack of effort or intelligence, but a misunderstanding of risk itself. Risk is often framed emotionally as something to be avoided rather than analytically, as something to be understood and managed. This misunderstanding leads people to make decisions that feel safe in the short term, but quietly undermine long term progress. A common example is the belief that diversification automatically reduces risk. In theory, diversification protects against uncertainty. And in practice, excessive diversification often dilutes understanding. Owning many things you don't deeply understand can feel safer, but it frequently results in average outcomes at best. True risk isn't volatility, it's ignorance. When people invest without understanding what drives value, they substitute quantity for insight. That may reduce anxiety, but it rarely builds conviction or long term advantage. At the same time, concentration without understanding is equally dangerous. This is where many narratives go wrong. People hear stories of success built on focus and conclude that concentration itself is the strategy. In reality, concentration only works when paired with deep understanding and a margin of safety. And without that, it becomes speculation. The difference between informed conviction and blind risk often looks subtle from the outside, but the outcomes diverge dramatically over time. Another misconception is that success follows a straight line. In reality, progress is uneven. Long periods of apparent stagnation are often followed by rapid gains. This pattern creates psychological pressure to abandon strategies prematurely. Humans are not naturally wired to wait through flat periods even when data suggests that persistence will pay off. As a result, many people quit just before compounding begins to work in their favor. There's also a tendency to copy outcomes without understanding context. When people see someone succeed, they often imitate the surface level actions, the industry, the asset class, the tactics, without understanding the conditions that made those actions effective. This is how bubbles form. When too many people pursue the same opportunity without understanding its underlying economics, returns disappear. The lesson isn't to avoid popular ideas, but to understand why something works before participating. Risk is also frequently misjudged because people focus on short term volatility instead of long term fragility. A stable looking path that slowly erodes purchasing power can be far riskier than a volatile one that compounds over time. Inflation, technological change, and shifting market structures quietly punish strategies that appear safe but lack adaptability. Real resilience comes from flexibility, learning, and the ability to adjust as conditions change. There's an additional cost to misunderstanding risk. Missed opportunity, excessive caution can be just as damaging as recklessness. Avoiding all uncertainty often means avoiding growth entirely. Many of the most meaningful opportunities exist precisely because they require patience, learning, and tolerance for ambiguity. Those willing to engage thoughtfully with uncertainty often find that risk diminishes as understanding increases. This is why good decision making frameworks matter more than individual outcomes. A sound process won't eliminate failure, but it will reduce the cost of mistakes and increase the likelihood that successes compound over time. This asymmetry matters enormously. Small advantages consistently applied create wide gaps in outcomes. The goal, then, is not to eliminate risk, but to choose risks that are understandable, manageable, and aligned with long term objectives. When decisions are grounded in evidence rather than emotion, and when learning is continuous, risk becomes something to work with rather than fear. That shift in mindset is essential for anyone trying to build something that lasts. When progress happens at scale, it almost always comes from the interaction between three forces: technology, institutions, and capital allocation. Each on its own can create incremental improvement. Together, they reshape entire systems. Understanding how they reinforce one another is essential for anyone trying to build something durable, whether that's as a business, a career, or an investment strategy. Technology is often the most visible driver. It reduces costs, expands reach, and increases the speed at which ideas move through the world. But technology alone rarely determines outcomes. What matters more is how it is deployed. A powerful tool used without the right incentives or institutional support often underperforms. Conversely, even modest technologies can have extraordinary impact when paired with smart design and aligned incentives. The history of development, healthcare, and education is full of examples where simple innovations scaled dramatically because the surrounding system allowed them to. Institutions are the connective tissue that determines whether progress compounds or stalls. They define property rights, enforce contracts, set standards, and shape trust. When institutions function well, they reduce friction and uncertainty, making it easier for individuals to take productive risks when they fail. Even strong ideas struggle to scale. This is one reason why similar technologies produce very different outcomes in different regions of the world. The technology may be identical, but the institutional environment determines whether it flourishes or fades. Capital allocation sits at the intersection of these forces. Capital is not just money, it's a signal about what society values. Where capital flows, talent follows. Where capital is constrained or misallocated, progress slows. The most productive systems are not those with the most capital, but those that allocate it effectively toward ideas that solve real problems and can grow sustainably. One of the most important lessons here is that scale is not achieved through intensity alone. It's achieved through repeatability. Systems that work once are interesting. Systems that work reliably across time, geography, and conditions are transformative. This is why experimentation matters. Small, controlled tests allow ideas to prove themselves before resources are committed. At scale, over time, this process filters out what doesn't work and amplifies what does. Technology has accelerated this feedback loop. Data allows organizations to learn faster and adapt more quickly and allocate resources with greater precision. But data alone isn't enough. It must be paired with judgment, an understanding of context, trade offs, and long term consequences. Without that, optimization can become narrow and counterproductive, improving metrics while undermining real outcomes. Another critical factor is time horizon. Many systems fail not because they lack intelligence or resources, but because they optimize for the short term. Short term incentives can undermine long term value creation. especially when decision makers are rewarded for immediate results rather than durable progress. This misalignment shows up in underinvestment in infrastructure, education, and research areas that produce enormous returns but require patience. When technology, institutions, and capital are aligned around long term goals, progress becomes self reinforcing. Improvements compound, learning accelerates, risk decreases because systems become more resilient. This is how entire industries transform, not through sudden breakthroughs, but through sustained alignment over time. For individuals, the lesson is not to replicate large scale systems, but to understand how they work and position themselves accordingly. This might mean building skills that complement emerging technologies, contributing to organizations with strong institutional foundations, or allocating capital toward efforts that solve meaningful problems. And the specific path will differ, but the underlying principle remains consistent. Scale comes from alignment, not force. Ultimately, what scales is not effort, ambition, or even intelligence in isolation. What scales are systems that continuously convert inputs into greater outputs with minimal friction. Understanding this changes how you evaluate opportunities, how you measure progress, and how you decide where to invest your time and resources. When those decisions align with how systems actually work, growth becomes less about pushing harder and more about letting structure do the heavy lifting. When systems fail to channel effort into productive outcomes, the cost is far greater than individual disappointment. It shows up as lost potential, wasted talent, and entire populations operating below their capacity. This isn't just a personal problem, it's an economic one. When people are unable to convert effort into durable progress, societies lose innovation, resilience, and long term growth. At an individual level, the cost often appears quietly. People work hard for decades, yet remain financially fragile. They delay long term thinking because short term pressures dominate over time. This creates a sense that progress is unattainable or reserved for others. That perception alone can be self reinforcing, discouraging experimentation and risk taking, even when conditions improve. The tragedy isn't a lack of ambition, it's a misalignment between effort and opportunity. At a societal level, the consequences are more visible. When large numbers of people are excluded from productive ownership, inequality widens and trust erodes. This isn't just a moral concern, it's an efficiency problem. Economies perform best when talent is widely distributed and broadly empowered. When people lack access to systems that reward contribution, innovation slows and social cohesion weakens. Growth becomes harder to sustain, not because ideas disappear, but because fewer people are positioned to act on them. Misaligned incentives also distort decision making at institutional levels. Organizations optimize for metrics that look good in the short term, but undermine long term value. Governments delay investments in education, infrastructure, and research because the returns fall outside political cycles. Businesses prioritize quarterly performance over resilience. These choices are often rational within the system, yet collectively damaging. Over time, the gap between what works in theory and what happens in practice grows wider. Another cost is psychological. When effort repeatedly fails to translate into progress, people internalize the failure. They conclude that the system is rigged or that they themselves are inadequate. Neither conclusion is accurate, but both are corrosive. They discourage learning, experimentation, and engagement, the very behaviors that enable progress. When this mindset becomes widespread, societies lose not only productivity, but optimism. There's also a generational dimension. Young people entering the workforce today face a landscape shaped by decades of compounding decisions, both good and bad. If systems remain opaque or inaccessible, each generation must relearn the same lessons at great personal cost. That is an enormous inefficiency. Progress should be cumulative, not repeatedly rediscovered. Encouraging realities that these outcomes are not inevitable. Systems can be redesigned, incentives can be adjusted, access can be expanded. History shows that when societies invest in education, infrastructure, and fair participation, returns compound across generations. The challenge is not knowing what works, but sustaining the will to act on that knowledge. The second step is developing leverage deliberately. That doesn't mean chasing every new technology or trend. It means understanding where small inputs create large effects. Sometimes it's learning a skill that compounds over decades. Sometimes it's contributing to a system that scales beyond your individual effort. Sometimes it's simply choosing environments where good decisions are rewarded consistently. Progress accelerates when leverage is intentional rather than accidental. The third step is maintaining a long term perspective in a short term world. Many of the most valuable investments in knowledge, trust, reputation, or infrastructure don't pay off quickly, but they tend to dominate outcomes over time. Patience here is not passive waiting, it's active persistence guided by feedback and adjustment. Small improvements, sustained long enough, create outcomes that look extraordinary in hindsight, but are entirely logical in retrospect. It's also important to recognize that this path is not about perfection. Mistakes are unavoidable, and setbacks are part of any system that involves growth. What matters is building resilience, the ability to learn, adapt, and continue over time. That resilience becomes its own form of leverage. The most reliable progress comes from understanding how the world actually works, not how we wish it worked. When effort, incentives, and systems align, progress stops feeling like a struggle and starts to feel like momentum. That's when individuals move from chasing outcomes to shaping them. The real opportunity isn't just to reach a financial milestone, it's to build a way of thinking that consistently turns effort into impact. And when that happens, the results tend to take care of themselves, not because of luck, but because the system is finally working with you instead of against you.